Chapter 2. As I said, everything began in that graveyard, but at the time I had no way of knowing this. October 28th that year seemed no different from any other. An end, not the beginning of anything. Why had my father killed himself? As I got into my old green Volvo and lurched down the side road away from the church, the question seemed no nearer an answer than it had before. I told myself what I always did. Let it lie. Forget it. What else can you do? But I could never forget, of course, not quite, and perhaps my mother's absence this year made it even more difficult. As the road twisted and turned through the tattered autumn hills of Perry County, I could sense her beside me and hear her voice, low and murmuring, as she remembered him. For paradoxically, that was always her way of forgetting. She'd close her eyes and lean back on the seat, and slowly the stories would come out, but stories so carefully and formally elaborated that they only served to distance him from us, gradually turning him into a character in an old movie that flickers on and on through the late show dawn. Long since I'd learned all the scripts by heart. Now, making my way back to the interstate, I wondered which one she might have selected this time around. My mother, une vraie Françoise, had first met my father when he'd been posted to Paris in 1938, so perhaps she might have recalled the crazy comedy about a bright young diplomat speaking ludicrous Iowa French who'd helped a manufacturer with some permits, received a dinner invitation in return, and then walked off with his daughter. Or she might have selected a melodrama, Bergman and Bogart, for she and my father had been falling in love just as Europe staggered toward war, drinking in the cafe floor as the Germans marched into Austria, huddling in my father's frigid apartment on Montparnasse as Chamberlain flew back from Munich and joined the phony war, crowds at the hit of the 1940 season, Maurice Chevalier's Paris Rest Paris, decades later. That particular detail could still provoke my mother's bittersweet laugh. But we didn't see the joke any better than other people, she'd quickly add. After the communists made their deal with Hitler, it seemed there was nothing to believe in, not even war. But of course the war came. They hurriedly married at the end of May as the Germans raced toward the city. After that, another favorite tale. There was a classic chase sequence, for my father suddenly panicked. Fearing that his diplomatic status might not guarantee my mother's safety, he'd rushed her out of Paris when the British embassy was evacuated in the first week of June. Your father had his little English car, and he steered it like a bicycle through all those refugees. I remember that we reached Bordeaux the day before Paris fell and listened to the broadcast on a portable radio. In those days, radios had very big batteries which gave off a peculiar smell when they grew warm. For years afterwards, that smell haunted my dreams. The war, however, merely provided the most dramatic of her stories. There were plenty of others. My father's classic guffaw with Christian Herder, the incredible saga of their sea voyage to Cape Town, a bizarre servant in Mexico City. Now, as the miles slipped by, I ran through them all, and a little to my surprise, the process worked once again. I skirted Harrisburg, dawdled through Hagerstown, and finally, as Interstate 81 swung west, I could feel the mystery of my father's death begin to recede for another 12 months. I arrived home shortly past noon. For me, home is now Charlottesville, Virginia, a small Piedmont town about 100 miles southwest of Washington, birthplace of Lewis and Clark, seat of the University of Virginia, discreetly Southern. As always, when I arrived, I couldn't quite believe that I'd actually settled there. Its population is only 35,000, swelled a trifle by the students, whereas I was brought up in a succession of world capitals, went to school in New York, Columbia, and spent most of my journalistic career in Berlin, Warsaw, and Moscow, all large cities. Whatever your ideological persuasion, nonetheless, when I tired of the Betacam rat race and came home again, I found New York and L.A. unendurable in turn and decided to try someplace smaller. Charlottesville won out for two reasons: the university with its excellent research facilities and the town's proximity to Washington, where I have most of my contacts. Now, after 3 years, I fitted right in, dreary proof that I was growing middle-aged, I suppose. But it's a town that lets you alone, and I was able to live the kind of life I wanted. Work, small pleasures, quiet routines, up at dawn, I usually wrote till noon, then strolled along to Murchie's, a local landmark, for the papers and cigarettes. For lunch, I normally indulged myself at the Mousetrap, or one of the other student hangouts, beer, sandwiches, an eye full of codes, and finally, protected by an alcoholic haze, I dutifully continue on to the Alderman Library for last week's Isvestia and the penance of some academic prose. That afternoon, turning off Emmett Street, I picked all this up in the middle and dropped in at the Mousetrap, but then decided to skip the university. There was no sense pretending I was going to get any work done today. Instead, I bought some food at the supermarket and headed straight home. I live on Walsh Street, near the old black section of town, in a white frame house decorated with Victorian gingerbread. I left the Volvo in the lane, then staggered up the walk with the groceries, maneuvered through the front door, and went straight through to the kitchen. The house felt cold, so I laid a fire in the old wood stove, the size of a locomotive and almost as complicated, then made coffee and carried it into the living room. Usually the visit to my father's grave was just a day's excursion, but this time I'd worked it in as the last leg of a 2-week trip to New York and Boston, so the room had a forlorn, abandoned air. Taking possession of the place again, I went around plumping cushions and opening curtains, put some Haydn on the stereo, and then slumped down on the sofa. Now the coffee table was directly in front of me, a pile of mail strewn across it. Perhaps I was simply tired, or perhaps it was the peculiar quality of this day, but I saw nothing unusual in this, and almost absently began sorting through the envelopes. Texaco wanted $58.93. Jimmy Swaggart devoutly prayed that I'd purchase a Bible, bound in genuine olive wood, for a minimum donation of $25. There was a letter from my agent about the French rights to my second book, but we'd already covered that in New York, and then junk, oddments, more bills, and a whole slew of magazines. The Economist, The Spectator, Foreign Affairs, Slavic Review, the Journal of Soviet Studies, BBC Monitor Soviet Broadcasts, the Red Army Journal, extracts and commentaries. I finished my coffee and carried the whole mess into my workroom. Like the workrooms of most men, I suppose mine gives a fair portrait of its owner, all the more so in my case, since I designed and built it myself. It's converted from an old screened porch running the full length of the house. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves cover the inside wall, 2,000 volumes, mostly about the Soviet Union. And on the outside, under the windows, there's a maple counter that constitutes my principal workspace. The tools of my trade were scattered there in their usual disarray: papers, drafts, off-prints from journals, notes to myself, illegible, a couple of Uher tape recorders, one of which worked, an IBM Selectric, an old Underwood I'd been dragging around for years as a sort of lucky charm, and my latest toy, an IBM PC, 640K Corona hard disk, C-ITO printer. But perhaps you don't share the new electronic enthusiasms. In any case, as I say, these bits and pieces provide the surest clues to my character. They should tell you I'm something of a solitary. Growing up as an embassy brat, I learned to get by on my own, and then my father's death seemed to set me apart from everyone else. But I also like my comfort. In my workroom, I'm never far from a comfortable chair, and one of the reasons I left journalism was the sheer misery of it. The borrowed apartments, pool offices, endless fast food. And lastly, you should be able to guess that I love my work. In a sense, that's also connected to my father. He died in 1956, a year before Sputnik, and in the great panic that followed, my high school in Washington began offering courses in Russian. It was just what I needed, something to lose myself in, and soon I was totally enthralled by the language, the country, the people. It's a fascination I've never lost, and for most of my adult life I've earned my living, in one way or another, as a Russian expert, as a journalist in Eastern Europe and Moscow, briefly, miserably, as a teacher, and now as a freelance writer. Even on that afternoon, I couldn't resist, and flipped on my machine. It greeted me with the IBM beep, and then a page from my third book flickered into green, ghostly life. I read it through, even felt my brain stir a little, but I knew I was too tired to do anything useful, so I went back to the living room and read myself to sleep. When I awoke, it was after 3, and the phone was ringing. Groggily, I staggered into my workroom to answer it, and felt the usual chest-tightening sensation when the girl said, "Western Union." "Yes?" "We have a telegram for you, Mr. Thorne. The text reads, 'Dear Robert, tried to reach you all week. Urgent. Please call 416-922-0250. Love, May.'" May Brightman. Even after all these years, hearing her name was like a blow to the pit of my stomach. "Mr. Thorne, sir?" Took me a moment to recover. I cleared my throat. I'm here, operator. Could you tell me where that was sent from? Yes, sir. The point of origin is Toronto, Canada. She was Canadian, though I'd never known her to live there. And could you read back that number again? She did so, and I hung up. May Brightman. I stood there, my hand on the phone. May. It had been a long time since I'd heard from her. 3 years, 5, but of course she always did keep in touch. Maybe a woman who rejects you can never quite leave you alone. Except that sounds bitter, and that's not what I felt. Enough time had passed, God knows. I was over her now. So there wasn't that pain, but there was still something else, a species of regret, a strange lack of completion. What had happened between us? Standing there almost 20 years after the fact, I still didn't know. She'd loved me. She'd never denied it, but when I'd asked her to marry me, I was very young and sufficiently romantic to do the deed on a bench in Central Park, a cinematic mist in the air. She'd said yes, right away, only to change her mind the next week with no clue as to why. Did she herself know? Maybe not. Maybe no woman in her place ever does. In any event, May Brightman had become another question I couldn't answer. Indeed, as I pulled myself together and went back into the living room, I thought how uncanny it was that she had called today, for there was another link to my father. I'd lived my life within the shadow cast by his death, and May had been my great attempt to step outside it. When she turned me down, I'd retreated again. If to admit the truth, I was a lonely man today, albeit as comfortable with my loneliness as a fish is with the sea. She was part of the reason, not the first cause, but the second. What could she want? In the living room, whiskey in hand, I pondered the question. Working it out, I realized it had been 5 years since we'd last met. That had been in France, just around the time I'd left television. I'd been fairly hard up. Somehow she'd known, and she'd offered me the use of her place near Sancerre while I finished my first book. This was typical of our contacts over the years. You couldn't say that we were now just friends, for the original relationship had been too complicated and intense, and its ending too mysterious, to permit anything so neutral. Yet she did keep in touch, almost protectively. Perhaps she felt a shade guilty. I wondered, in fact, if that wasn't all she now wanted, just a word to know how I was keeping. Except the telegram had said urgent, not a word you'd normally associate with her. When I'd first met her in New York, she was studying the cello at Juilliard, and one of her instructors had complained that she had a lazy bow, which, in certain moods, was just what she was like, a soft note lazily drifting through a summer's afternoon. Since her father had money, she'd never worked, and so far as I knew, she still lived alone. If she turned me down, I at least had the comfort of knowing she'd never accept another. Maybe because of that she'd grown a trifle eccentric over the years, but she'd always had the calm, cool confidence of the rich and wasn't easily flustered. There was nothing urgent in her life whatsoever. In fact, the only time I'd seen her truly afraid was the one night when she tried to tell me why she'd decided not to go through with our engagement. But almost 20 years later, that could hardly be the cause of her anxiety. What the hell? I put down the bourbon and picked up the phone. She answered on the first ring, as though she'd been sitting there waiting, and she was obviously very upset. Robert? Robert, thank God it's you. I'm sorry, I only got back this minute. Western Union just called. I've been phoning you. I phoned you every day last week. I sent another telegram Wednesday. I was in New York. What's the matter? She took a breath. I'm sorry. I'm all right. It's my father. He's disappeared. I know it sounds insane, but he's vanished. He just went off. No one's seen him. I never met her father, but I knew he was important to her. In fact, I'd sometimes suspected that her refusing me had some connection with him, for her change of mind had taken place after she'd flown up to Toronto to see him, to tell him the happy news, as I'd thought at the time. When did this happen? 10 days ago, a week ago Saturday. You've told the police? Yes, they were worried he might have been kidnapped, but there hasn't been any ransom note, and now they say he's just gone off on his own and will turn up when he feels like it. Well, they're probably right. It's upsetting. No, they're not right. He'd never go off without telling me. Her voice had exploded with anger. The intensity of it was startling, but then she caught herself and added, Robert, I'm sorry to trouble you with this. No, of course not. Maybe I shouldn't have called. Of course you should have. I'm just trying to think. What can I do? She hesitated. There's one thing. I'm afraid he's killed himself. I know all the reasons why you'll say he hasn't. The police have already given them to me, but I'm still afraid. Suicide. On this day, of all days, it wasn't a question I could easily dismiss. Why do you think that? I'd rather not say, not on the phone.
But you do have a reason, something specific?
Yes. Have you told the police about it? They don't think it means anything. That's why I called you. I need someone who can find things out for me, someone who knows how to ask questions.
May, I'm not a policeman.
But you're a journalist, Robert. You can get things out of bureaucrats.
I paused. Once upon a time I had been a journalist, but I'm not any longer, and I hate getting things out of bureaucrats. What sort of things?
It's personal. I'd rather not say, not till you get here.
So you want me to come to Toronto?
Yes, I know you must be busy, but it won't take very long. I'm sure it won't take very long.
She was right. I was busy. The past 2 weeks had been a holiday, more or less, and I was anxious to get back to work. She said,
And of course, I'll pay your way. You,
Don't be silly. I thought for a moment longer, but there really wasn't much choice. She was clearly upset, and even if I couldn't help her, and I was certain I couldn't, I could at least hold her hand till her father showed up. You're sure you can't tell me anything more? I heard her sigh.
You know I'm adopted.
Yes, I remember. Remember, I could sense her falter as I said the word, as if she was uncertain about how much she could rely on the past we hadn't quite shared.
But then she went on, It has something to do with that. That's what I want you to find out about.
All right.
You'll come?
Of course. I can probably be there tomorrow. A breath, all relief, fluttered down the line.
Thank you, Robert. Bless you. I'll meet you at the airport.
No, that'll only get complicated. Just give me your address, and I'll try to make it by early afternoon, and you try to relax. So she told me where she lived. We said goodbye and hung up, and right away I knew that something was wrong. It was an odd sensation, strong, definite, and yet unaccountable. For a moment I thought it was just the call itself, a strange summons, under strange circumstances, fears about the suicide of a father on precisely this day, and given our past connection, any conversation was bound to be awkward. But such feelings could hardly be the cause of the intense unease that now swept across me. May's request, by any standards, had been unusual, and if I'd had the faintest idea of where it was going to take me, I would have felt foreboding. But in fact, that wasn't at all what I felt. It was more a particular sensation, as if I was being watched, as if someone else was with me in the house, and then, thinking this, I knew what it was. On the phone, May had said she'd sent me 2 telegrams, the one I'd received today, but another last Wednesday when I'd been in New York. It hadn't been in my mail, I was certain, and now I checked again to be sure. It wasn't. Carefully, I played my arrival back through my mind. As I'd come in, I'd had a bag of groceries in each hand. To work the lock, I'd balanced one on my knee, and then I'd kicked the door shut behind me and gone straight through to the kitchen. From there, the sequence was perfectly clear. I'd carried my coffee into the living room, tidied up for a moment, and slumped down on the sofa. And that's when I discovered my mail, a great pile, 2 weeks' worth, scattered all over the coffee table, instead of lying in the hall under the mail slot, where it ought to have been.